suggestion is that grievances be noted, and I give the call to the member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I wanted to talk today about what is ahead, for what I'm trying to pursue for Wentworth. And so what I really wanted to do is start out with someone who I've talked a lot about, a guy I met back on the campaign trail, Sean from Bondi. And he was wheeling, is still very vivid in my mind. I was on Bondi Beach, and he was wheeling his, on the promenade by Bondi Beach, and he was wheeling his probably 2 or 3 year old on a tricycle along the promenade. And I said to him, look, what's important to you? And he said, for me, the environment's really important. I live in Bondi because I love the natural environment. I want to give this to my children. He said, I want us to be a kind society. I want us to be a decent society. And then finally, he said, I'm a small business owner, and that's really important to me, the economics, the cost of living. And I think those values are still so true to whole of Wentworth, and were very true on that day and have stuck with me. And so what I wanted to do today was to try and outline what I'm hoping to achieve with Wentworth and for Wentworth this year. So to start out on climate, on the environment, because that's what he identified. What I've seen and talked to people in Wentworth is they want ambition on climate change. They want us to have science-based targets, but which can also be deliverable, practically deliverable for the economy as well. And so that is why I'm advocating for a 75% reduction by 2035, because it can achieve both those things. But they also want to be able to make that change themselves in their local community. And I think there are really three key things here. That's about household electrification. That's about rooftop solar, particularly for people in my community who are renters, apartment dwellers, and live in stratas. And then finally, that's about EVs, electric vehicles and electrical charging infrastructure. And that's going to be the focus of what I'm going to do. Because we've consulted the community. We had Wentworth's Climate Action Summit last year. We've sat down with the state members and with the local councils. And there's a real appetite for change for these local issues, but also making a change at a national level. And that's what I'm seeking to do. National issues, but then local action. So on household electrification, we want to turbocharge the uptake of efficient electrical devices powered by rooftop solar, and which is the cheapest electricity in the world. And I think to drive that, we'll need concessionary finance in the budget to help low middle income houses electrify in particular, and also the bulk retrofit of public and social housing. On rooftop solar, there's a critical missing gap for renters and apartment dwellers who cannot access rooftop solar. It's almost 20 years ago I was involved in Sydney Renewable Power Company. 10 years ago I was involved in Sydney Renewable Power Company, and we set up a solar company purely to deal with renters and apartment dwellers who couldn't access solar, but they still 10 years on still can't access the benefits of solar on apartment roofs or if they are renters. And so that is a critical area for change, and that means broadening the remit of existing solar banks programs so that strata managers and owners corporations can access the loans as part of this. We need regulatory reform to break the barriers facing renters who can't access rooftop solar. And we need mandatory information disclosure on household energy bills when renting. And then the final piece on climate is EVs and EV infrastructure, including driving the uptake of EVs across the country, which are things like strong mandatory fuel efficiency standards and targeted investment, and supporting the investment, public and private, in charging infrastructure, particularly on the streets of Wentworth, because so many of us don't have garages and or off-street parking. And an electric vehicle task force to coordinate a national uptake in electric vehicles. So those are some of the key priorities for me in terms of climate, but I will also be supporting key action on the environment, such as the review of the EPBC Act and to end native forest logging. The second piece that Sean asked me was to be kind. He wanted an inclusive, kind society. And there are some things that people in Wentworth have said are really important to them. They want action on refugees. They want to end the indefinite detention of refugees, and they want to give those on temporary visas a pathway to permanency, a pathway to putting down permanent roots in this country. I'm disappointed so far that the government has made commitments on particularly that reduction in giving people a pathway to permanency, but we have not had the detail or yet the action. So I will be keeping up the pressure on the government in relation to refugee policy, particularly on the abolishment of TPVs and CHEVs. They want, a lot of people talk to me about the health system. There's real concern about, GP access and, what does it mean in a kind society if people can't access GPs? But an issue that I remember was raised a lot with me in the electorate is around youth mental health. And I heard a lot of that in the election time. I remember very vividly one woman coming out of a polling booth and saying to me, holding her daughter's hand, with tears in her eyes, she said, "I just voted for you." And she said, "My daughter is 13. She could not access mental health support for her eating disorder, and it has absolutely torn our family apart. I want you to do something about that." And I think it's not just eating disorders. It's the issue of youth mental health is an absolutely critical issue, for the community, but also for Wentworth in particular, because the annual rate of death by suicide has risen from 10 per 100,000 young people to 14, a 40% increase in the last decade. We are getting richer, but our younger people are killing themselves in record numbers. And this is while it's more typical for males and females, the rate has almost doubled from females over the decade, from 3.7 to 6.6. This is both a youth mental health crisis. It's also an issue that particularly affects young men as well as young women. And I think young men haven't had a strong voice in this area, and I will be working with my community on youth mental health. And in that lastly, on the kind society, I think there are two other things I wanted to mention. One is about a second public high school, because my community in Wentworth wants us to invest in the community, and they want to have great educational choice. We have wonderful private high schools and a great public high school. We have great public and private primary schools, but only one public high school in an electorate of ours is really disproportionate, and we know that families are seeking additional public education. On kindness, I will also be very much supporting the Voice to Parliament, and that's my community group, Wentworth for the Voice, are absolutely passionate about that. So as part of this kind society that Sean and others have asked me to pursue, I think that the Voice to Parliament is absolutely critical, and I'm looking forward to engaging the community on this. And then finally, I don't forget that Sean said he's a business person, and that's one of his most important priorities. And certainly as a business person, as someone who studied economics, it's also one of mine. And so I will be leading also discussion on economic policy, because frankly, we haven't had economic reform in this country, for around 2 decades. And that means that we are missing out on opportunities to better enable people to access the prosperity that comes, with strong economic reform, as well as, ensuring that we can supply great services. So the areas I'll be pushing on are firstly monetary policy. We have a huge challenge of getting inflation under control. The RBA, for example, has raised rates again. I think it's for the 9th time for the families, and this is not going to be the last time. We have a huge challenge here. And so this is going to, we are reviewing monetary policy, but we also then need to look at fiscal policy, because at the moment, the high level of government spending, it's a record level of 27% of GDP, is part of the reason why inflation is so high, and we absolutely need to address that. And in addressing fiscal policy, fiscal policy pays for really, really important things that we all value. But there isn't enough focus on, is the dollar that we're spending the most effective use of that dollar? Are we getting real value for that? One of my colleagues spoke just now about, measuring what matters, talking about, measuring outcomes that really matter to people, like well-being, like health, like education outcomes. They're really important. But we should know whether the dollar that we're spending is getting the best possible outcome for that investment. And so I'll be advocating, for greater scrutiny and accountability on existing spending projects, and including infrastructure spending. I will also be advocating, and have been advocating, on tax reform. Again, it's not an area that everybody's interested in, but frankly, tax experts, Treasury, international groups like the OECD all agree that we need to change our tax mix. And, particularly with this high level of inflation, Australian people, Australian, workers are paying more and more tax as their bracket creeps up with a really high inflation. So it is actually time to really address that for the community. And this is about, for me, both about making sure we're a productive nation, but it's also that we're fair to the community, to the generation that comes underneath. And the last piece I'll be focusing on is ensuring that Australia is the best place to do business. It's going to be a big year ahead, and those are just the things I'm going to try, but there's will be a lot else will be thrown at me. But these are some things you asked for, Wentworth.